Hello, this is Dr. Alan Branch. I want to talk to you today about Born This Way, Homosexuality, Science, and the Scriptures. Let me begin by giving a disclaimer. I teach ethics at a seminary. I have a PhD in theology with an emphasis on ethics, so I am not a neuroanatomist, I'm not a geneticist, I'm not a scientist, but I have made a very rigorous review of the primary sources, and so everything I'm about to show you is a summary of the primary source data regarding homosexuality and the Born This Way argument. I published my findings in a book called Born This Way, Homosexuality, Science, and the Scriptures. So the idea that is very pervasive in our culture and which many people find compelling is that people are gay because they are born gay. We see this in Lady Gaga's song Born This Way, where she says, no matter gay, straight, or bi, lesbian, transgendered life, I'm on the right track, baby, I was born to survive. No matter black, white, or beige, cola, or orient made, I'm on the right track, baby, I was born to be brave. So notice how she compares gender identity and sexual orientation with ethnicity, and she's saying they're the same thing, and just as someone is born with a particular ethnicity, someone is also born with a gender identity, a sexual identity. So she says in her course, I'm beautiful in my way because God makes no mistakes. I'm on the right track, baby. I was born this way. And this argument has been very compelling to many people, and it is a good shorthand way of explaining how many folks view homosexuality from both a moral and then a civics issue. So the idea is that since homosexuality is like ethnicity, and it is wrong to discriminate people against people personally or legally because of their ethnicity, it is also wrong to discriminate against people because of their sexual orientation. So here's some talking points. So the question is that true? And that's what we're trying to answer here. And what I'm going to argue and what follows is that, in fact, Lady Gaga has vastly oversimplified things, and that homosexuality is not a trait like your hair or your skin color. So here are your talking points. Homosexuality is not a trait like skin color. Correlation does not equal causation. No trait has been discovered which is both necessary and sufficient for causing homosexuality. And finally, because someone may have a predisposition, this doesn't equal predetermination towards a particular way of acting. So the most common theory to explain the Born This Way, or the one that seems to get the most traction right now, is what's called the prenatal hormone theory. Prenatal hormone theory. And basically it works like this. Hormones drive sexual development. If someone is XX genetically, you have two X chromosomes, then you are female. If someone has an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, they are male. And so the idea is that early in development, XX babies get hormones that drive their genitalia to develop in a female way. They look like girls. And then boys get hormones that drive their genitalia to develop in a male way, they're XY. And so the idea is that later on, when the brain is sexually differentiating later in pregnancy, and this is very important, the theory is built upon the idea that genitals sexually differentiate first in development, in prenatal development, and then the brain sexually differentiates later in prenatal development. So the idea is that homosexuals got the correct or gender-specific hormones, or the hormones that correspond with their genetic sexual gender. So XY babies got male hormones and XX babies got female hormones. But the claim is that something happened later on prenatally, and when the brain was differentiating, XY babies with male genitalia had a brain that for whatever reason differentiated along a female way, either didn't get enough androgen or got too much estrogen or whatever. And female babies, X babies received the wrong hormones. They got too much male hormones, or they weren't able to process their female hormones. So the theory is really quite simple when you think about it, and I believe its simplicity is why it has an appealing explanatory explanation to many people. Basically, it says step one in prenatal development, the genitals develop consistent with someone's sex, but then later on in development, the brain differentiates more like the opposite sex, and so it's conceptually kind of simple to understand. So the question is that true? Animal research is often used to substantiate this claim. So there's been a lot of research where mice and rats have been given the wrong hormones prenatally. So you have a rat that's pregnant, and the scientists would inject male hormones into a female rat prenatally, and they would inject male hormones into a male rat prenatally. And as you might imagine, these rats and mice, these rodents, act odd. So you would have these male rats and male mice that received female hormones would raise up their rear end, a practice called lordosis, their two other males as if they wanted to be mounted like a female. And then you would have female rodents who received male hormones prenatally in utero, and they would try to mount other female mice like they're a male. So this has been kind of an aha moment for many people. Well, the challenge with that is that animals act instinctively, humans are volitional. And truth be told, these male rats who receive the female hormones, if a scientist puts on his or her glove, places a hand down in the cage and starts stroking these animals on the back, they'll raise up their rear end in the act of lordosis, even for just the finger of a scientist. They're certainly not sexually attracted. They're just acting instinctively. Humans are volitional. Disorders of sexual development only show weak to possibly moderate support for this theory. It's unethical to do an experiment to prove the theory, so one has to look for natural experiments. So disorders of sexual development provide some sort of natural experiment. Perhaps you've heard the term intersex, means the same thing. These are people who have genitalia that don't look like the normal genitalia for someone of their sex. So a common one is congenital adrenal hyperplasia. I say common, it's 1 in 15,000 to 1 in 25,000 kids. But the body produces too much androgen, and in girls, boys can have it too, but in girls, the girls can develop genitalia with male characteristics. Their clitoris takes on phallic-like characteristics. There are different levels of expression for congenital adrenal hyperplasia, from a mild effect on the genitals of the girl to a very profound effect upon the genitals. But here's what we know. These girls received male hormones in utero. We know this happens. So the question is, what is their sexual orientation? And what you find is the vast majority of girls with CAH self-identify as heterosexual, but a higher percentage than the general population self-identify as homosexual. So in the general population, about 98% of non-CAH females are heterosexual. However, about 90% of CAH females are heterosexual. So that's substantially 10% compared to 2%. So it is substantially higher. So it appears that perhaps the hormones had some sort of effect on sexual orientation. But the problem is it's hard to disentangle the genetic influence from the social experience of growing up with a DSD. The fact is, however, the vast majority self-identify as heterosexual. So it certainly doesn't prove the prenatal hormone theory. It shows that there might be some influence at some level, a moderate to low level. Well, do homosexuals have different brain structures than heterosexuals? Do they? This is a fair question. If the prenatal hormone theory is true, this would seem to pop up. So here's the theory. Same-sex attraction is caused by men having brain structures more similar to the average woman, and women having brain structures more similar to the average man. First of all, I want to remind everyone that the brains of males and females are far more similar than they are different. The most common difference being that men have a slightly larger volume because God gave us a little bigger cranium. However, that doesn't mean that men have more neurons. Men and women have the same number of neurons, the same capacity for intelligence and learning, and anything else that's really important for us when we think about cognitive abilities have same capacity. But the brains are very similar. It's not as if female brains have some part that males don't have and males have some part that women don't have. No, we have the same parts. They tend to differ in maybe size or proportion and this sort of thing. But the findings about male and female brain differences are quite contradictory at times, and they are all over the place when you look at the data. I want to talk about one region of the brain. It's called the INAH3, and this goes back to 1991. A man named Simon LeVay, a neuroanatomist and a very smart man. He was the director of the Salk Institute, which is a very prestigious position and should give you some idea of his intelligence and capability as both a leader and a scientist. So in 1991, he got together 41 cadavers, I think it was in Los Angeles, and he's looking at this region called the INAH3. To give you an idea of where it's at, this is the front of the brain, this is the back. It would be located up in here, these 4 cell clusters. You're looking at the brain from front to back. Here is the location of these 4 cell clusters. And to give you an idea of how very discrete they are, they're not like an appendix or an amygdala or something like that. They're cell clusters. So this is a study from a photo from a 2008 study. And do you see how very discrete these INAH3 regions are? The interstitial nuclei of the anterior hypothalamus number 3 is all these cell clusters are very discrete. They're hard to measure. Doesn't mean they can't be measured, just means it's hard to do because they're discrete regions of the brain. So here's what he claimed. He took 41 cadavers. He had 19, which he included were all homosexual males, including 1 bisexual, 16 heterosexual men, and then he had 6 heterosexual women. And here's what he claimed. This is his central claim. He said the INAH3 cell group was more than twice as large in heterosexual men than in women and homosexual men. So what he's claiming is homosexual men have an INAH3 that looks like a woman's. Thus, this explains the reason they are attracted to men. This INAH3 is driving female attraction to men. It's also driving homosexual attraction to men. So that's his central claim. This is a very fascinating reproduction of a chart that LeVay had in his study. So this is an identical reproduction. I got this from a book on endocrinology. It was extremely accurate. So LeVay provided this plot diagram, and it's very interesting. Here's what I want to show you. He has these 6 females. He's measuring their INAH3. And notice what he's claiming. These 4 and all these homosexual men down here, see how they cluster together? So he's saying that because they share this small INAH3 size, this explains why both groups are attracted to males. However, look at the chart more clearly and something should emerge to you. It's very interesting. First of all, you have a pretty small sample overall, so it's a challenge to make global pronouncements about all humans based on a sample of 41. But first of all, look at this. You have 3 heterosexual males who have an INAH3 size that is the same as the majority of the homosexuals and the women. What that shows is having a particular INAH3 size is not sufficient to cause homosexuality. Then look up here. You have 3 homosexual males with an INAH3 size, which is the same as the majority of the heterosexuals. That shows that having a particular INAH3 size is not necessary to cause homosexuality. I would suggest to you that LeVay's own data shows that a particular INAH3 size is neither necessary nor sufficient to cause homosexuality. And this is what I'm trying to say on this slide right here. It's not necessary to cause it. It's not sufficient to cause it, neither necessary nor sufficient. In 2001, a guy named William Bine attempted to replicate LeVay's data. He made some interesting claims. His claims are a bit more should say narrow than LeVay's. He said there's no difference in the number of neurons at the INAH3 between heterosexual males and homosexual males, but he says the neurons do seem to be packed more tightly in homosexual males. Here's what they said, in 2001, based on the results of the present study as well as those of LeVay, sexual orientation cannot be reliably predicted on the basis of INAH3 volume alone. And since 1991, there's been no clear replication of LeVay's results. What I would suggest to you is the common differences we see between male and female brains. For example, generally, men have a higher percentage of white matter and women have a higher percentage of gray matter in the brain. But no difference has been discovered here for homosexuals. And so what I'm driving at is the sort of differences that are claimed between male and female brains are not typically found between heterosexual and homosexual brains. So the theory has weak evidence. So what can we learn from twin studies? As you might imagine, it'd be very interesting to look at identical twins if one is homosexual and homosexuality is a trait like hair or skin color, then the other should be homosexual as well, unless one was perhaps counting in some epigenetic influence. But here's what you find. A common claim that gets repeated a lot is the 1991 study by Bailey and Pollard. I'll go ahead and tell you this data is bad. They were claiming that when you had two brothers and they're identical twins and they're both, if one of them's homosexual, they were claiming 52% of the time the other brother was homosexual as well. The identical co-twin was homosexual as well. We now know this data is bad. It gets repeated a lot, but we know it's inaccurate. Why? Because in 2000, looking at a larger sample from the Australian twin study, discovered that if one identical twin brother was homosexual, only 20% of the time was the identical co-twin also homosexual. Now that's much higher than the normal population, 20%. So it shows some genetic influence or variable at work at some level, but it hardly shows causation. And a 2010 Swedish study had very similar results. I think this data is pretty robust. So if one identical twin is homosexual, the chances the co-twin will also be homosexual is much higher than in the average population, but the vast majority are not homosexual. This higher occurrence demonstrates the plausibility of some genetic factor in exhibiting a low level of influence. So it's a factor, it's a variable, it's not a single causation, but it's a part of a matrix of things that perhaps may lead some people to homosexuality. But it's hard to say that this proves this for every homosexual. It's interesting data. And actually the data strongly questions the born this way claim. Why? Because if homosexuality were in fact a trait like hair or skin color, then every identical twin who is a homosexual would also have their co-twin to be homosexual. But it's very clearly not the case. So what we see is twin studies strongly show that homosexuality is not a trait like your hair or your skin color. It's more complex than that. If homosexuality were completely genetic, there would be 100% correspondence. So has science discovered a gay gene? Well, the short answer is no. And the theory is briefly stated, people are homosexual because they have a gene or a combination of genes in a manner similar to the way that genes code for skin color or eye color. The most famous example of this, or argument for this, is Dean Hamer, 1993. He's homosexual. By the way, Simon LeVay's homosexual. Dean Hamer is a homosexual as well. So he had a sample of 40 pairs of homosexual brothers. They weren't all twins, but they were all brothers. And it's a long story how he got his sample and narrowed it down, which is sort of interesting for people who like to mine data information. But what we're going to focus on is his claim. Here's his main claim, that 33 of 40 pairs of homosexual brothers had co-inherited genetic information in the X chromosome in a region called XQ28. That's his specific claim. Now, sometimes I've had students say that Dean Hamer discovered XQ28. That's incorrect. Science had known about the XQ28 region for a long time. What he claimed to find was something going on in the XQ28 region for homosexual brothers. So, He did not claim to find a gay gene. He's looking at a region. In fact, XQ28 is a gene-dense region. There's lots of genes in there. So essentially what he did was, it would be equivalent to something like this. Let's say that I called you up and I was telling you about news from Kansas City, and I said something like this: a crime occurred in Kansas City last night. And you said, well, where did the crime occur? And I said, well, in Kansas City. Well, this is a large city with a large area. Well, but where in Kansas City? Did it occur on Troost Avenue? Did it occur on Ward Parkway? Did it occur down on the plaza? Did it occur in the Power and Light District? Where did it happen? So if I tell you a crime occurred in Kansas City, I made a very general statement. Well, something like that is a good analogy for what Dean Hamer is claiming. He's basically saying something's going on in XQ28. Well, there's lots of stuff in XQ28. And also, he did not claim everyone in the sample had the same genetic sequence. What I would point out to you is this. When people hear that he claimed to find co-inherited genetic information, what they think is of these, remember, 33 of 40 brother pairs. So this would be 66 brothers. What people think they hear him saying is that all 66 of these brothers had the same G's and A's and T's and C's lined up in the same order, the same genetic sequence, same base pair sequence. But that's not what he claimed. What he claimed was all 33 of the different brother pairs shared something common, but the genetic sequence was different between all of them, but they all shared something in common in XQ28. So this is a far cry, an extremely far cry from saying that you found a gay gene. And to be very transparent, in my opinion, it's one of the most overhyped claims in science in the last 30 years. In 1995, he's doing some more research, and he claimed he could find nothing for females, but then something interesting. He found in his 1995 research that some of the heterosexual males shared something at XQ28 with their homosexual brothers. Now, this is fascinating. One brother is heterosexual, one is homosexual, but they're both sharing something at XQ28. This is showing that having some sort of something going on in XQ28 is not sufficient to cause homosexuality, because if it was, there would be no difference. They'd both be homosexuals. So this very interesting. Here's what he said in 1995. Even within the selected population that was studied, the XQ28 region was neither necessary nor sufficient for homosexual orientation. That's an honest statement from Hamer. So there was a claim in 2015 by some guys out of Chicago, Sanders and Bailey, that they had replicated Hamer's claim. A lot of people tried, and a lot of people could not do it. I'm skipping over lots of research. So they had a larger sample, 409 pairs of grade brothers from 384 families. They actually discovered two regions of linkage. They claimed one area on the chromosome 8, 8q12, and then also XQ28. But then you have to look at their findings very carefully. While they claim to have replicated Hamer's data, actually neither Hamer or Sanders or Bailey are claiming to have found a specific gene. And in both cases, the genetic sequence at XQ28 was different among each of the brother pairs. I can't stress this enough. They didn't all share the same genetic sequence. Didn't have all the same G's and A's and C's and T's lined up. What was common was the location of the sequences. But also, Sanders and Bailey admit their results have weak predictive power. And in fact, when they claim to have replicated Hamer's claims at XQ28, when you read their article that they published, they actually admit, well, to tell the truth, our findings at XQ28 came up just short of statistical significance. Okay, well, either you replicated Hamer's claim or you didn't. So I have a real problem there touting that we replicated Hamer's claim, but then when you dig into the research, they say, well, it really falls short of statistical significance. So did you or didn't you replicate his claim? It sounds like you didn't, but you think you almost did. So here's a response. They said this is a direct quote from their study in 2015. Regarding any scenario that research in this area will result in a prenatal genetic test for homosexuality, the small magnitude of effects suggested herein are inconsistent with the test that those motivated to influence their children's sexual orientation would find useful. Do you see what they're saying? They're saying our research has very weak predictive power. Science is all about predictability. And they're admitting their research has weak predictive power, which tells me they haven't found anything that causes homosexuality. And again, they admit that data on XQ28 actually was just below the threshold for significance. Now, I would point this out to you. This was done by a private company, 23andMe, and in 2012 they presented findings of some of their research at the American Society of Human Genetics. This was not published in a journal. It was a paper they presented at a professional meeting, and it was a private company. It's not grant-based research. But they were using a more modern and precise method of looking at genes. They looked at a sample of 23,000 individuals, and they could find no linkages reaching genome-wide significance for same-sex sexual identity for males or females. It's very interesting. So no one has discovered a gay gene. Some regions of possible interest for males in some particular samples, but no one has found any areas of interest for females ever. So I would point out that even if one is going to try to argue that Hamer's and Sanders and Bailey's research points to something, they're going to have to admit that their genetic explanation has limited explanatory power because no one's found anything for females, so you're only explaining half the cases of homosexuality. Does having more older brothers make one gay? This is called the fraternal birth order effect. I'm going to summarize it quickly. The claim is each older brother increases the odds of homosexuality by 33% in the next brother. The theory claims 1 out of 7 homosexual men can attribute same-sex attraction to the fraternal birth order effect. Well, is this true? Well, there's a lot of problems with where they get their samples from, but a 2006 study of the entire population of Denmark found no substantial birth order effect whatsoever. And more than that, I would just tell you, half or more of all homosexual men have 0 older brothers. So again, this explanation has very limited explanatory power. So here's a summary. Contrary to popular opinion, scientific research has not found a gay gene. There is no conclusive evidence that homosexuals have a substantially different brain structure than heterosexuals. And a survey of modern scientific research demonstrates there are some factors with a low level of influence that correlate with a higher incidence of homosexuality among some populations, but no one has found biological or genetic factors that cause homosexuality. And this distinction between correlation and causation is extremely, extremely important. You can correlate any number of things. You could correlate ice cream sales in the summer in Kansas City with Royals baseball victories, but that doesn't prove, correlation doesn't prove causation, and you must remember that correlation doesn't equal causation. There may be some cases where some genetic component or variable is contributing to someone's same-sex orientation, homosexual orientation at some level, but it's hard to disentangle that from a lot of other variables. And we can't stress the degree to which correlation does not equal causation. Here's what Lisa Diamond of the University of Utah said in 2013. She's very much on board with civil rights for homosexuals, pro-homosexual agenda. And she says, I feel as a community, the queers, and by the way, she's speaking from within the community. This is not an ad hominem. She's using that word as self-identity. So she's not using it in a bad way. But anyway, I feel as a community, the queers have got to stop saying, please help us, we're born this way and we can't change, as an argument for legal standing. I don't think we need that argument, and the argument is going to bite us in the rear end because we know that there's enough data out there that the other side is aware of it as much as we are aware of it. And what she's saying is, if from within the homosexual community, if they're honest, the data about being born this way is pretty thin. So I hope that you will consider these thoughts carefully as you wrestle with what it means for someone to say that a person is born this way in regards to gender identity, or especially in regards to sexual identity and sexual attraction.